I had always loved camping alone. There was something about the solitude, the deep silence of the woods, and the crackling of a fire that made me feel at peace. But after what happened that night, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. It was early spring, and I had driven up to a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, where a barely marked trail led to a small, secluded clearing near a river. No other cars were parked near the trailhead, and the hike-in was completely silent, just the sound of birds, the occasional rustling of branches in the wind, and my own boots crunching against the damp earth. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a fire. It was peaceful, the kind of night where the world felt still, like I was the only person left on Earth. I cooked my dinner, read a few chapters of my book, and eventually settled into my tent. I was lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric of the tent as the fire outside cast flickering shadows. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard something. A twig snapping. It was faint, but in the dead silence of the forest, it was unmistakable. I held my breath and listened. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or a raccoon scavenging near my campsite. Then another snap, this time closer. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated. If I turned it on, whatever was out there would know exactly where I was. But the idea of just lying there, waiting for something unseen to approach, was worse. I clicked it on and pointed it at the thin mesh of my tent's door. The fire outside had died down to embers, so the light from my flashlight barely illuminated beyond a few feet. Nothing. I let out a quiet breath, convincing myself I was overreacting. But then, a sound that made my skin crawl. A low whisper. It wasn't words, at least none that I could understand. Just a faint, broken murmur, like someone was trying to speak, but couldn't quite form the sounds. I sat up, gripping my flashlight tightly. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the trees, just beyond where my fire had burned. I grabbed my pocket knife, my only real means of defense, and forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" Silence. The footsteps stopped. The whispering stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't alone. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped out, flashlight shaking in my hand. I swept the beam across the clearing. The trees stood still. The air was cold and unmoving. But I felt it. Someone was watching me. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I nearly dropped the flashlight. My hands were clammy as I pulled it out and looked at the screen. A text message from an unknown number. "Why did you stop talking?" My breath hitched. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Another vibration. "Turn around." I didn't. I couldn't. My entire body felt frozen. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then, from the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. A shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. My flight instinct finally kicked in. I bolted for my backpack, grabbing my car keys. I didn't bother packing anything. I just ran. The entire way back to my truck, I felt like I was being followed. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. When I reached my truck, I jumped in, locked the doors, and floored it. My hands were shaking the entire drive home. The next morning, I forced myself to check my phone. One last text had come in just before I reached my truck. "See you next time." I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be going camping alone again.